Secretary Jack Kemp eulogizing Winston Churchill. I love the Churchill story they tell about the reporter who was once kind enough to let a rising young politician named Winston Churchill preview an upcoming article about his recent speech. At the end of a long quotation from Churchill's remarks, the newsman had written the word cheers to describe the audience's reaction. Churchill scratched it out. The reporter was amazed by what he thought was an unusual display of modesty, until Churchill wrote instead, loud and prolonged applause. So if there are any reporters in the room tonight, I'd like to have a word with you after this speech. This thrilling era of global change, of peaceful democratic revolutions following the sudden collapse of Soviet totalitarianism labeled by President Bush the Revolution of 1989, was anticipated by Churchill over 4 decades ago. But more than that, I believe his post-war leadership helped lay the foundation for the policies of deterrence and strength that culminated in today's historic events. Far from being a warmonger, Churchill was in fact the earliest advocate of peace through strength. He spent 10 lonely years determined to inform the British people about the growing threat of Nazi rearmament and aggression and repeatedly challenged the government's policies of appeasement and weakness. He openly disputed the government's figures on the balance between British and German military strength. He insistently demanded the creation of a ministry to supply munitions. He bluntly asked whether Britain was doing all it could to defend democracy. "We must recognize that we have a great treasure to guard," Churchill said 2 years before Munich. "The inheritance in our possessions represents the prolonged achievement of the centuries. There is not one of our simple, uncounted rights today for which better men than we have not died on the scaffold or the battlefield. We have not only a great treasure, we have a great cause." The tragedy of Munich marked the turning point for Great Britain and for Winston Churchill's political future. The policies of weakness and appeasement followed by Ramsay MacDonald, Stanley Baldwin, and Neville Chamberlain failed. The Nazis marched through Czechoslovakia, Poland, Scandinavia, the Low Countries, and rolled through France to the very gates of Paris in just 40 days. Malevolent eyes turned on Britain. In this dark hour, a desperate Britain summoned Churchill to lead the nation into war. The wilderness years were over. The Battle of France had ended. The Battle of Britain had begun. Now in charge of the entire scene, Churchill recorded that he slept soundly and had no need for cheering dreams. "I felt as if I were walking with destiny," he said, "and that all my past life had been a preparation for this hour and for this trial. I was sure I would not fail." 3 weeks into Churchill's government, while British forces were evacuating at Dunkirk, Mussolini offered to mediate between Britain and Germany. Germany would get France and the continent. Britain would get independence, to be assured by Hitler. Many in the War Cabinet favored open talks. They believed Britain could win better terms before the attack that was sure to come. Churchill was vehemently opposed. When the meeting was open to the entire cabinet, Churchill gave an impassioned speech. His wrath grew with every word, words that poured forth relentlessly, hurled down like thunderbolts. "Nations which went down fighting rose again," he told his ministers, "but those which surrender tamely are finished." The stunned cabinet erupted in applause. In a few minutes of powerful reasoning, Churchill turned uncertainty into resolve, apprehension into determination, fear into hope, and with it, a near defeat into an eventual triumph. Ladies and gentlemen, that is what great leadership is all about. Listen to his words as war threatened to engulf the British Isles and fear had displaced hope. Sir Winston said, "These are not dark days, these are great days. The greatest days our country has ever lived. And we must all thank God that we have been allowed, each of us according to our stations, to play a part in making these days memorable in the history of our race." What was it that ultimately sustained him over 6 long decades of public life in triumph and tragedy, in the First World Crisis following the Dardanelles, through the wilderness years, during the war years, after his defeat in 1945? President Kennedy talked of his courage. Field Marshal Montgomery spoke of his determination. President Eisenhower said it was his defiance. Lord Beaverbrook mentioned his ambition. President Reagan credited his optimism. Clement Attlee called it luck. Yet all these attributes marked the essential character of Winston Churchill. But in the end, I believe the anchor of his days was a profound faith in the overpowering force of ideas. Not just any ideas. Churchill's was a deeply held commitment to freedom and democracy, ideas which ennoble the long story of Britain, ideas extending from the Magna Carta to the birth of America's Declaration that all men are created equal, ideas which he believed were an eternal promise to transform the world for men and women everywhere. From statesmen of Churchill's rank, lessons can be learned that apply nearly every political situation. What can we learn from him in our new post-Cold War era? There is a debate raging on the right where most interesting debates now take place. How involved should the U.S. be in the world now that the Soviet Empire is shrinking and aggression is waning? What should our stance be in a post-Cold War that is unipolar rather than bipolar or multipolar? Some want to turn inward since there are no great threats to our national security. Some say, "Come home, America." Others believe that we must continue an activist, forward-based strategy of spreading the global democratic imperative of freedom and opportunity for all, and that spreading democracy and entrepreneurial capitalism is a moral as well as a political necessity. Only a few months ago, probably about as many people had heard of Kuwait, or know where it is on a map, as had heard in 1935 of Abyssinia, or knew where it was. Churchill, still out of power, saw Mussolini moving into Abyssinia. With typical foresight, he asked, "Who is it to say what will come of it in a year or 2 or 3? With Germany arming at breakneck speed, England lost in a pacifist dream, France corrupt and torn by dissension, America remote and indifferent." The Western democracies did nothing to stop Mussolini in Abyssinia. Ethiopia fell. Then Hitler took the Rhineland. The Anschluss followed. Then the Sudetenland, then Prague, then Poland, and Pearl Harbor. The world, supposedly liberated from the global threats only 20 years before, once again plunged into war. I believe President Reagan, President Bush, Prime Minister Thatcher, and others in the West learned Churchill's lesson. We know what will follow if the world does nothing to reverse Saddam Hussein's aggression in Kuwait. Saudi Arabia will be next, and the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Jordan, and then the only democracy of the Middle East, Israel. With Hussein asserting hegemony over all the Persian Gulf, the world might be at war yet a third time. Yet in the early 1930s, Hitler and Mussolini were far more dangerous than the clownish dictators portrayed by Charlie Chaplin. And Saddam Hussein is far more than a 2-bit tyrant or third world expansionist. He is armed with chemical weapons. He has already waged a 10-year war of aggression that cost 1 million lives. He will have nuclear weapons in the not-too-distant future. Not only must we stop Hussein, we must break his sword. Those who think that conservatism only meant anti-communism only know half the story. America must do more than just stand against something. America's mission is to stand for something, to be that city on the hill, as President Reagan said. When the American colonies broke away from Britain, Jefferson, Adams, and the founders published the immortal Declaration of Independence. Isn't it remarkable that they did not begin with what they were against? The Declaration's story begins by stating what America is for. We are for the idea that all men are created equal. We are for the natural rights of all human beings. We are for government by consent of the governed. America's mission to the world did not end when communism ended. Our mission is ongoing. It was recognized by Sir Winston in his Iron Curtain speech, inscribed in the very words on this wonderful award. Our mission is to continue to tell the world that we are for the freedom and human rights of all men and women, for all time, and to do everything we can to transform the ancient dream and hope of freedom into a democratic reality everywhere. And with God's help, we will.